Okay, so let's talk about this renderer resource. So this renderer resource, we generally do not have to use this, but sometimes yes, we need to use this resource. Now why sometimes we do not have to use this? Because while working on this Lightning framework, this Lightning framework has its rendering service, and this rendering service basically what it does is it creates and manages the DOM elements. Okay, it creates and manages the DOM elements of the component. So you do not have to worry about this. So in most of the cases, this render resource is not much used, but sometimes we use it. So this rendering service calls four base functions. One is the render function, the other one is after render, then re-render, and then unrender. So this rendering service provided by Lightning framework call these functions. Okay, let's do one thing. Let's call these as base render function, base after render function, base re-render function, and base unrender function. So this rendering service calls base render function, base after render function, base re-render function, and base unrender function. But again, the other question that comes to our mind is when these functions are getting called. Okay, when? To answer this question, when, we need to talk about rendering and re-rendering life cycle. So whenever your function is getting called, okay, so if this is the lifespan of your component, so we have developed this component, registering component, and this is the lifespan of this registering component. At t equals to 0, this function is getting called, and at t equals to capital T, the life of the component gets over. So life is over, it doesn't mean that you basically delete the component. It's like that component is no more called, it's no more in the memory. All the DOM nodes that were created for that component are now deleted. So in this lifespan of the component, you know what? At t equals to 0, when this component gets called, the rendering service will call the render function. And what this render function will do, it will create the DOM nodes for the elements of the component. Or I should better say base render function. Okay. At time t equals to 0 plus delta t, when this render function, this base render function will get executed, then after that at time t equals to 0 plus delta t, one more function will get called. Okay, one more function will get called, and that function is base after render function. Okay, in between delta t to t, whenever there is any change in the component data in time t equals to 0 plus delta t to t equals to t, the remaining lifespan of this component, if there is any change in data, if there is any event occurs, if any event which change the data, if any such event fires, in that case base re-render function will get executed. Okay, so render function, after render function, and re-render function. Re-render function will get executed whenever there is any change in the data in the component, defined in the component. At t equals to capital T, when the life of this span is over, when all the DML nodes are getting destroyed, are getting deleted, at this time, when all this is over, this rendering service will call one more function, unrender. This function will get called. Now, if I want to modify any of this function, render function, after render function, re-render function, or the unrender function, if I want to modify any of them, okay, if I want to play with the DML nodes which are getting created, or I want to modify those DML nodes which are created by a framework, by this framework for this component, if I want to modify them, then I can use renderer resource. Okay, so this renderer resource is useful to modify the base renderer, base after renderer, base re-render, and base unrender functions, which are getting called when in the life cycle of the component, in the rendering and re-rendering life cycle of the component. This renderer function, after renderer function, re-render function, and unrender functions are getting called. Okay, so what we do is in the renderer resource, we define JavaScript function with the name render. Okay, and in this render function, first thing that we do is calling the base function, calling base render function. And the second thing that we do is custom rendering. Okay, so first call the base render function and then do the custom rendering. Now how to call this base render function? We'll take this later. And after custom rendering, this render function has a return type, and it should return the DOM nodes or array of DM nodes. So it has a return type. Okay. Now, same thing goes with after render. In after render function, you need to first call the base after render function. After that, interact with DOM elements. Okay. So render, after render, same kind of thing goes with re-render, and similar thing we do with unrender. So this render function has the return type. After render, re-render and unrender, they don't have the return type. Let's take a look once again towards this. So Lightning framework has rendering service. This rendering service create and manage the DOM element of the component. But sometimes we want to modify these DOM elements, and then we use a renderer resource. So first thing that we understand is the use of rendering service. Rendering service basically call render function, after render function, re-render function and unrender function. And when these methods getting called, based on the lifespan of, or looking at the lifespan of the component, when the component is getting initiated, render function will get called. Actually, I should have used 0 plus delta t. You know why? Because before this render function, init function get called. If init function is defined, then that function will get called. But since we have not studied init function so far, we'll talk about it later. So let's consider that first render function will get called. After that, after render, if any change in the data, if any event get fired which change the data within the component, then each time this re-render function will get called, and when the lifespan of the component is over, unrender function gets called. And sometimes we want to modify these functions. Whenever we modify these functions, we define them in the renderer resource with the same name. And first thing that we do is we call the base function first. We'll see the syntax for that, how to call the base function. And then for the render function, there is whatever custom rendering you want to do it after that. And then in the return, you have to pass the this DOM or array of DOM nodes, or maybe nothing. Well, it has the return type. Okay. And after render and re-render and unrender, we do the same thing. Okay. After render, we interact with the DOM element. Re-render, we re-render, or we do the custom re-rendering thing, whatever we want. And then unrender, we first call the base function, and then we do the custom unrendering. Okay. So now we are good with the theoretical part, but theoretical part is incomplete, or the knowledge is still incomplete until we practice it. So let's do that.